The blood trickled down Eleanor Kincaid's chin as she staggered backward, her hand flying to her swelling cheek. The town square of Bandera, Texas, fell deathly silent in the summer of 1875, every pair of eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Judge William Thornton towered over her, his knuckles white around his walking cane, face purple with rage. "You will hold your tongue in my courtroom and in my town, Miss Kincaid," he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "Women who speak out of turn receive what they deserve." Eleanor tasted copper in her mouth but refused to lower her gaze. At 22, she had already endured more than most women twice her age, and backing down wasn't in her nature even when it should have been. The judge had ruled against the widow Carson, allowing the banker to seize her home despite clear evidence of her husband's paid mortgage. Eleanor, serving as the widow's friend and witness, had called the ruling what it was: corruption. That's when the judge's cane had struck her across the face. From the edge of the crowd, a tall figure moved forward. Russet hair glinted copper in the Texas sun as Rhett Holloway stepped into the circle that had formed around Eleanor and the judge. His presence alone commanded attention, not just for his imposing 6'3" frame or the twin Colt revolvers holstered at his hips, but for the quiet authority he carried. At 28, he had already made a name for himself across 3 counties as a man who stood for something. "That's enough, Judge," Rhett's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "You've made your point." The judge turned his fury toward the newcomer. "This doesn't concern you, Holloway. This woman needs to learn respect for the law." Rhett moved beside Eleanor, his shoulder slightly in front of hers. Respect for the law, or respect for the men who twist it to their benefit? He reached into his vest and withdrew a folded document. "I have here the original deed to the Carson property, with the banker's own signature acknowledging payment in full. Seems to me the one disrespecting the law is standing right before me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge's face paled slightly. "If Miss Kincaid was struck for speaking her mind," Rhett continued, his voice carrying across the square, "then I'll be her voice. And mine carries a bit further in these parts." Eleanor's eyes widened. She had seen Rhett Holloway around Bandera over the past few months since he'd arrived, but they'd never exchanged more than polite nods. His reputation as a former Texas Ranger turned private cattle detective preceded him fair but formidable, the kind of man who could track rustlers across 3 states and bring them back to face justice. The judge seemed to shrink slightly, suddenly aware of the shifting mood of the crowd. "This matter will be reviewed at another time," he muttered, turning to leave. "And the widow Carson keeps her home in the meantime," Rhett called after him. Not a question. The judge didn't turn back but gave a curt nod before disappearing into the courthouse. Only when the crowd began to disperse did Eleanor allow herself to touch her cheek again, wincing at the tenderness. The metallic taste of blood remained in her mouth. "You need to have that looked at," Rhett said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. Eleanor straightened her back. "I've had worse." A flash of something anger, concern crossed his face. "That doesn't make it right." He extended a handkerchief. "May I?" She hesitated before accepting it, pressing the clean cloth to her split lip. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway, for the handkerchief and for intervening. Though I could have handled it." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I don't doubt that for a second, Miss Kincaid, but sometimes even the strongest voices need an echo." He glanced toward the courthouse. "Judge Thornton has powerful friends. This won't be the end of it." "It never is," she replied, "but I won't be silenced by a man like that." Rhett studied her for a long moment. "No, I don't suppose you will be." He tipped his hat slightly. "Allow me to walk you to Dr. Mitchell's office." "That's really not," Eleanor started, then stopped when a wave of dizziness hit her. Reluctantly, she nodded. Perhaps that would be wise. As they walked slowly down Bandera's main street, Eleanor was acutely aware of the eyes following them, of the whispers trailing in their wake. Women who challenged men like Judge Thornton rarely fared well, but she couldn't bring herself to regret speaking up. What did surprise her was the cowboy beside her, who had risked his own standing to defend her. "You're new to Bandera," she said finally, breaking the silence between them. "8 months," he replied. "Long enough to learn who wields power and how they use it. And you still stepped in. Most men would consider that unwise." Rhett's expression remained neutral. "I've never had much patience for bullies, regardless of the title they carry." They reached the doctor's small office at the end of the street. Before they entered, Eleanor turned to him. "Why did you have Mrs. Carson's deed?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "I've been investigating Thornton and Bradford the banker for several months. Land swindles, mostly. The widows and small ranchers are always the first targets." He kept his voice low. "Your friend, Mrs. Carson, isn't the first they've tried to cheat." Eleanor absorbed this information, studying him. "You're more than just a cowboy passing through. Let's just say I have a personal interest in seeing justice done." He opened the door to the doctor's office. "We can discuss it further when you're patched up." Dr. Mitchell was a kind-faced man in his 50s who clucked disapprovingly at Eleanor's injury. "This is becoming a habit with you, Miss Kincaid," he said, though there was no real reprimand in his tone. "Someone has to stand up to them," she replied, wincing as he cleaned the cut. "And someone usually does," the doctor agreed, glancing at Rhett, who stood by the door. "Though it typically ends with them needing my services too." Rhett's face remained impassive, but Eleanor caught something in his eyes, a flicker of some old pain, quickly suppressed. "Will she be all right?" he asked the doctor. "A few days of discomfort, but nothing permanent. She's fortunate the cane didn't catch her eye." Dr. Mitchell finished applying a salve to Eleanor's cheek. "I'd recommend rest, but I know better than to suggest that to Miss Kincaid." Eleanor smiled despite her pain. "You know me well, doctor." After the examination, Rhett insisted on escorting Eleanor to her home, a modest but well-kept cabin at the edge of town where she lived alone, supporting herself through her work as the town's only female bookkeeper. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Holloway, but I don't need a protector," she said as they approached her home. "Everyone needs allies, Miss Kincaid, especially when challenging men like Thornton." She stopped at her gate, turning to face him fully. "Is that what we are now, allies?" "I hope so," he answered simply. "Because what you did today takes courage, but courage alone won't be enough against what's coming." Eleanor felt a chill despite the warm Texas evening. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "That we compare notes. I've been gathering evidence against Thornton and his associates for months, but I need more to build a case that will stick." He hesitated. "You know the townspeople, their stories. Together, we might actually have a chance of stopping them." Eleanor considered his words carefully. She had indeed been keeping records of the judge's suspicious rulings, the banker's foreclosures, the properties that mysteriously changed hands. It had been a solitary mission until now, dangerous and likely futile. "Come by tomorrow evening," she finally said. "Bring what you have." "I'll do the same." Rhett nodded, relief evident in his face. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Kincaid." As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Mr. Holloway, why did you really intervene today? The truth." He paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Because 3 years ago my sister stood up to a man like Thornton. No one stood with her." His jaw tightened. "She's buried in Virginia soil now." Before Eleanor could respond, he tipped his hat and walked away, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. She watched him go, her hand unconsciously touching her bruised cheek, wondering what kind of storm she had just invited into her life. The following morning, Eleanor awakened to find her face swollen and discolored, the pain more intense than the night before. Still, she dressed carefully for work, applying cold compresses before leaving her home. The bookkeeping office where she worked for Mr. Abernathy was one of the few establishments in Bandera that employed a woman, and only because Eleanor had proven herself twice as efficient as her male predecessors. She had barely settled at her desk when the door opened, and Mrs. Carson entered, her eyes reddening when she saw Eleanor's face. "Oh, my dear girl," the older woman hurried forward, grasping Eleanor's hands in her own. "Look what speaking for me has cost you." "It's nothing, Mrs. Carson, and worth it. You'll keep your home now." The widow shook her head. "That brave Mr. Holloway came by this morning to assure me the matter was settled. He refused any payment or thanks." She hesitated. "He asked about you." Eleanor tried to ignore the small flutter this news caused. "Did he? What did he want to know?" "If you were truly as stubborn as you seemed," Mrs. Carson's eyes twinkled despite her concern. "I told him you were worse." This drew a laugh from Eleanor, followed by a wince as her split lip protested. "You've always been honest to a fault, Mrs. Carson. As have you, my dear. That's what got you into this predicament." The older woman squeezed her hands once more before releasing them. "Be careful, Eleanor. Judge Thornton doesn't forget slights, and that banker Bradford is even worse. They say he's had men killed for less than what happened yesterday." "All the more reason someone needs to stand against them," Eleanor replied, though she couldn't dismiss the warning entirely. "Don't worry about me. Focus on keeping your home in order." After Mrs. Carson left, Eleanor tried to concentrate on her ledgers, but her mind kept returning to Rhett Holloway. His revelation about his sister haunted her. She wondered what had happened, what kind of man had been responsible, and how it had shaped the cowboy who had stepped forward to defend a stranger. The day passed slowly, with more townspeople than usual finding excuses to visit the bookkeeping office. Some offered quiet words of support, while others simply stared at her bruised face with morbid curiosity. By closing time, Eleanor was exhausted from the attention and the constant throb of pain in her jaw. As she walked home, a young boy ran up to her, thrusting a folded note into her hand before darting away. She opened it to find a hastily scrawled message. "Cancel tonight. You're being watched. Meet me at dawn by the old sycamore east of town. R.H." Eleanor crumpled the note, scanning the street with new awareness. Sure enough, a man she recognized as one of Bradford's clerks was leaning against the hitching post across the way, watching her with poorly disguised interest. How had she not noticed him before? And who else might be observing her movements? She continued home, her steps measured and calm despite her racing heart. Inside her cabin, she moved through her evening routine as usual, lighting lamps and preparing a simple meal. Only when she was certain no one could see through her windows did she pull out the box hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. The box contained her meticulous records of Thornton's and Bradford's dealings, property transfers, suspicious rulings, names of victims and witnesses. 3 years of careful documentation that could destroy powerful men if it fell into the right hands, or get her killed if discovered by the wrong ones. Eleanor added the box's contents to her satchel, along with a small Derringer pistol her father had given her before he died. Then she waited for night to fall completely. At midnight, she slipped out her back door, wearing dark clothing and her most practical boots. She took a circuitous route through the woods behind her property, emerging well outside of town near the old Garrett farm. There, she spent the remainder of the night in the abandoned barn, dozing fitfully until the first light of dawn began to streak the sky. The old sycamore stood alone in a clearing about a mile east of Bandera, its massive trunk and spreading branches making it a landmark visible for miles. Eleanor approached cautiously, her hand close to the derringer hidden in her pocket. Rhett emerged from the shadows of the tree, his face grim. "You weren't followed. I took precautions," she replied. "Why the change of plans? Bradford's men were watching your house last night. 2 by the front, 1 by the back trail." His eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance. "You noticed. I had a warning." She held up his crumpled note, though I would have preferred more explanation. There wasn't time. He gestured to a pair of horses tethered nearby. "We need to talk somewhere safe. My cabin is about an hour's ride from here." Eleanor hesitated. "I have work today. People will notice if I'm absent. They'll notice more if Bradford's men drag you out of town for questioning." Rhett's voice was blunt. "After yesterday, they're desperate to know what information you have, who you've talked to. It won't be gentle questioning, Miss Kincaid." The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt cold despite the early morning warmth. "I brought my records," she said finally. Relief flashed across his face. "Good. Let's go before anyone comes looking." They rode in silence through the rugged Texas hill country, following game trails and creek beds rather than established roads. Eleanor couldn't help but admire how easily Rhett navigated the challenging terrain, clearly familiar with every hollow and ridge. After about an hour, they emerged into a small, hidden valley, where a sturdy log cabin stood beside a clear spring. "It's not much," he said as they dismounted, "but it's defensible and off any maps." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small table with chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves lined with books that surprised Eleanor with their variety. Rhett busied himself lighting a fire and putting coffee on to boil. "You should rest," he said, nodding toward a chair. "You look like you didn't sleep much." "Hard to sleep when you're hiding in someone else's barn," she replied with a wry smile, setting her satchel on the table. He looked up sharply. "Whose barn?" "The old Garrett place. It's been abandoned since last winter." "Smart choice. Unlikely anyone would look there." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups when it was ready, bringing one to her. "We should compare what we know." For the next several hours, they laid out their evidence side by side on Rhett's table. Eleanor's meticulous records of property transactions and court rulings complemented Rhett's collection of statements from victims, maps of properties seized, and documents showing the true ownership of businesses supposedly run by different people, but actually controlled by Bradford. "This is worse than I thought," Eleanor said, looking at the full picture for the first time. "They've essentially taken control of half the county." Rhett nodded grimly. "And they're expanding. These latest land grabs aren't just about greed, they're about something bigger." He pointed to a map where he had marked properties recently acquired. "See the pattern? They're securing all the land along the proposed railroad route months before the route was publicly announced." "Inside information," Eleanor breathed. "That would be worth a fortune." "Enough to kill for," Rhett confirmed. "And they have." He pulled out another document, a list of names with dates beside them. Accidents, sudden illnesses, disappearances, all people who stood in their way. Eleanor recognized several names, townspeople who had died under circumstances that had seemed unfortunate but not suspicious at the time. Seeing them listed together painted a much darker picture. "We can't take this to the local sheriff," she said. "He's Thornton's brother-in-law." "No," Rhett agreed. "But I have a contact in Austin, a federal marshal I worked with when I was a ranger. This is enough to get his attention, especially with the railroad corruption angle." He hesitated, looking at her with concern. "Eleanor, if we do this, there's no going back." These men will know exactly who exposed them. It was the first time he had used her first name, and somehow that made the gravity of the situation even clearer. "I understand the risk," she said steadily, "but I can't live with myself if I walk away now, not after seeing all of this." She gestured to the evidence spread before them. "Not after what happened to your sister." Pain flashed across his face at the mention of his sister. "Abigail," he said softly. "Her name was Abigail. She was a schoolteacher who refused to falsify property records for the local judge. When she threatened to expose him, he trailed off, his hands clenching into fists. By the time I got there, it was too late." Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I'm sorry, Rhett." He looked down at their hands, then turned his to clasp hers. "That's why I can't let you face this alone. I won't lose anyone else to men like Thornton." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. For a moment, neither spoke, connected by their joined hands and the shared understanding of what they were facing. A sound outside broke the moment, a twig snapping, too heavy to be wildlife. In an instant, Rhett was on his feet, gun drawn. "Get down," he whispered, extinguishing the lamp with his free hand. Eleanor crouched beside the fireplace, heart pounding as she pulled her derringer from her pocket. Rhett moved silently to the window, peering out cautiously. "3 riders," he murmured. "Coming up the trail. Bradford's men. Can't tell yet." He moved to a trunk in the corner, pulling out a Winchester rifle. "There's another way out, a tunnel that leads to a cave behind the waterfall. If things go wrong, that's your escape route." "I'm not leaving you," she hissed. He turned to her, his expression fierce. "Eleanor, the evidence is what matters. If something happens to me, you need to get it to Marshal Cole in Austin. Promise me." Before she could respond, a voice called from outside. "Holloway, we know you're in there. The judge wants a word with you and the Kincaid woman," Rhett cursed softly. "Bradford's right-hand man, Phillips, and he wouldn't have come all this way for a friendly chat. What do we do?" Eleanor whispered, "Play for time." He handed her the rifle. "Cover the window, but stay out of sight. I'm going to try to talk to them." Rhett moved to the door, keeping to the side. "What does the judge want, Phillips?" he called out. "Just to clear up a misunderstanding about some paperwork you showed yesterday. Seems it might not be authentic." "Seemed authentic enough to make him back down in front of the whole town," Rhett replied. "Why don't you boys head back and tell him I'll bring it to his office tomorrow?" A different voice answered, harder, colder. "That's not how this works, Holloway. Send out the woman and the papers, and maybe you walk away from this." Eleanor moved to Rhett's side, ignoring his warning glance. "I have a counter-offer," she called out. "Leave now, and we won't send copies of what we have to every newspaper from here to Austin." Silence followed her words. Then a burst of laughter. "Spirited, ain't she? No wonder the judge wants her silenced." Rhett and Eleanor exchanged glances. "They're not leaving without a fight," he said quietly. "Then we give them one," she replied, her grip tightening on the rifle. "On my signal, aim for the trees to the left," he instructed. "I'll take the right. We're not trying to hit them yet, just keep them pinned down while I work out a plan." The first shot came without warning, shattering the window and sending splinters of glass flying. Rhett pushed Eleanor down, returning fire through the broken window. She scrambled to the other window, firing the rifle toward the trees as he had instructed. For several minutes, gunfire echoed through the small valley as they exchanged shots with their attackers. Eleanor had never been in a gunfight before, but her father had taught her to shoot when she was young, and desperation made her aim true enough to keep the men from advancing. "We're outnumbered and they have better positions," Rhett said during a lull in the shooting. "We need to get to the tunnel." "What about the evidence? Already packed it," he replied, nodding toward his saddlebag by the door. "We'll take the horses through the cave." There's a path that leads out the other side of the mountain. Another volley of shots splintered the door. Going somewhere, Holloway, Phillips called out. We've got all day. Rhett motioned Eleanor toward the back of the cabin. Keep them distracted, he whispered, moving to a bearskin rug that partially covered the floor. He pulled it aside to reveal a trapdoor. Eleanor fired 2 more shots out the window, then rushed to help Rhett with the trapdoor. The opening revealed a narrow set of steps descending into darkness. I'll go first, Rhett said, lighting a small lantern and handing it to her. Bring the evidence. I'll come back for the horses. Be careful, she whispered, suddenly afraid to let him out of her sight. He paused, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, but instead he squeezed her hand briefly before disappearing down the steps. Eleanor gathered their evidence into Rhett's saddlebag, along with some food and ammunition, keeping her ears attuned to the movements outside. The men seemed to be repositioning, perhaps sensing something was wrong with the sudden silence from inside the cabin. Holloway, last chance, Phillips shouted. Send out the woman and the papers now, or we burn you out. The threat sent a chill through Eleanor. She hurried to the trapdoor just as Rhett reappeared from below. They're going to set fire to the cabin, she whispered urgently. I heard. His face was grim as he took the saddlebag from her. The horses are too noisy to move now, they'll hear us. We'll have to leave them and go on foot. A new sound drew their attention, the unmistakable whoosh of an object flying through the air, followed by the crash of breaking glass and sudden flare of light as a flaming torch landed inside the cabin. Go. Rhett pushed Eleanor toward the trapdoor. She descended quickly, Rhett following close behind, pulling the trapdoor shut just as more flaming projectiles crashed through the windows above. The tunnel was narrow and rough-hewn, barely tall enough for Rhett to stand upright. They moved as quickly as they dared by the light of the small lantern, the sound of splintering wood and crackling flames growing fainter behind them. How long have you had this escape route? Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Since I built the cabin. A man in my line of work makes enemies. And what line of work is that exactly? You said cattle detective, but this seems more complicated. He gave a short laugh. I was a ranger for 7 years. After Abigail died, I left to pursue her killers on my own. That led me to investigate other corrupt officials across the state. The cattle work is real, but it gives me cover to move around and ask questions. The tunnel gradually widened, the rough walls giving way to natural cave formations. The sound of rushing water grew louder until they emerged into a larger chamber, where a small waterfall cascaded from an opening in the rock face, creating a curtain of water that concealed the cave entrance from outside. We can rest here a moment, Rhett said, setting down the saddlebag. They won't find the tunnel entrance easily, and the fire will keep them occupied. Eleanor sank onto a rock, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The events of the past 2 days being struck by the judge, the revelation of the corruption, the gunfight, their escape, all of it crashed over her at once. She realized she was shaking. Rhett noticed immediately, moving to sit beside her. Are you hurt? She shook her head. Just processing. She attempted a smile that didn't quite form. I've never been shot at before. You handled yourself well, he said, his voice gentle. Better than most would on their first gunfight. What happens now? Where do we go? Rhett pulled out a small flask from his jacket, offering it to her. First, a drink to steady your nerves. Then we head south through the hills. I have another safe house about 15 miles from here. Eleanor accepted the flask, taking a small sip of the whiskey inside. The liquor burned going down but did help calm her trembling. 15 miles is a long way on foot. We'll take it slow. The important thing is staying ahead of Bradford's men until we can reach my contact in Austin." He studied her face in the dim light. "How's your cheek feeling?" She touched the bruise, almost having forgotten it in the chaos. "Oddly enough, I think the gunfight took my mind off it." That drew a genuine smile from Rhett, transforming his serious face. "There's a first time for everything, I suppose." They rested for about half an hour, sharing water and jerky from Rhett's supplies. Eleanor found herself studying him when he wasn't looking the strong profile. The capable hands that handled weapons with such ease, yet had been so gentle when offering her his handkerchief in the town square. What kind of man risked everything for a woman he barely knew, all because of a promise to a sister he couldn't save? When they continued their journey, they emerged from behind the waterfall into the late afternoon sun. Rhett led the way through dense woods, avoiding trails and open areas. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone intimately familiar with the wilderness, occasionally pointing out landmarks or interesting plants to Eleanor as they walked. "How did you learn all of this?" she asked after he showed her a particular type of berry that was safe to eat. "My father was a tracker and guide before he settled down to ranch," Rhett replied. "He taught me everything he knew about surviving in the wild, said a man should always be able to live off the land if necessary." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was." Rhett's voice softened with memory. "He would have liked you. Said the measure of a person was whether they stood for something or just stood around." "And you?" Eleanor asked. "What do you think the measure of a person is?" He considered this as they navigated a rocky slope. "Whether they use their strength to protect others or to control them," he said finally. "I've seen too many men who mistake power for right. Like Judge Thornton. And men like the one who killed Abigail," he agreed. "Power corrupts when there's no one to challenge it." They walked in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Texas hills in gold and amber. Despite the danger of their situation, Eleanor found herself noticing the beauty around them: wildflowers dotting the meadows they skirted, hawks circling lazily overhead, the distant silhouette of deer moving through the trees. As twilight approached, Rhett led them to a small clearing beside a creek. "We'll rest here for the night," he said. "Too dangerous to keep moving in the dark, and we're far enough from the cabin now." He quickly set about gathering wood for a small, well-concealed fire, while Eleanor collected water from the creek. They worked together efficiently, as though they had done this many times before. With the fire burning low and a simple meal of jerky and hardtack consumed, they sat side by side, watching the flames and listening to the night sounds of the wilderness. "Tell me about your family," Rhett said suddenly. "You know about my sister, but I realize I know very little about you beyond your courage in town." Eleanor smiled at the compliment. "Not much to tell, really. My father was a school teacher who came to Texas after the war. My mother died when I was 14, consumption. Father raised me on his own after that, teaching me everything he thought a woman should know, plus everything he thought a man should know too." "That explains a lot," Rhett said with a small smile. "He believed women should be educated the same as men, said minds don't have genders." Her expression grew sad. "He died 3 years ago, heart failure, left me his books, his principles, and just enough money to start over in Bandera. And no other family," she shook her head. "None that claimed me after he died. His views were considered radical by some of our relatives back east." Rhett nodded thoughtfully. "So you made your own way." "I did what was necessary," she replied simply. "Learned bookkeeping, found work with Mr. Abernathy, built a life." She looked up at the stars now appearing in the darkening sky. "It was enough, until I started noticing patterns in the ledgers. properties changing hands too quickly. Loans called in despite regular payments. That's when I started keeping records. Dangerous work for anyone, let alone a woman alone. Eleanor turned to look at him directly. Is that concern I hear, Mr. Holloway, or doubt about my capabilities? His eyes met hers steadily. Concern, Miss Kincaid, never doubt. The intensity of his gaze made her heart beat faster. In the firelight, with his guard slightly lowered, she could see not just the determined lawman but also the man beneath, one who had known loss, who carried pain, but who still chose to fight for what was right. "Why did you really defend me in the town square?" she asked softly. "The truth. Was it just because of your sister?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment, stoking the fire with a stick. "I'd noticed you before that day," he admitted finally. "Watching you stand up to Bradford when he tried to intimidate Mrs. Peterson at the general store. Seeing you teach the Carson children to read when no one else would spare the time." He looked up at her. "People like you are rare, Eleanor. The kind who see what needs doing and do it, regardless of the cost. People like us," she corrected gently. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself. Maybe so. They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence charged with unspoken feelings and growing awareness of each other. Eleanor found herself hyper-conscious of his proximity, of the way his shoulder occasionally brushed hers as he tended the fire. "We should get some rest," he said eventually. "We have a long walk tomorrow." He laid out his bedroll near the fire and insisted she take it, despite her protests. "I'll keep watch for the first few hours, then wake you to take a turn," he said, settling against a tree trunk with his rifle across his lap. Eleanor was more exhausted than she had realized. Despite the hard ground and her concerns about Bradford's men, she fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the quiet sounds of the creek and Rhett's steady presence nearby. She woke sometime in the darkest part of the night to find Rhett gently shaking her shoulder. "Your turn to watch," he whispered. "Any signs of movement, wake me immediately." She nodded, taking the rifle he offered and moving to sit against the tree. Rhett hesitated before lying down on the bedroll she had vacated. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "thank you." "For what?" "For trusting me. For being willing to fight. Not everyone would." She smiled in the darkness. "Get some sleep, Rhett. You'll need it when I drag you into the next gunfight." His soft chuckle was the last sound before he fell silent, his breathing soon growing deep and regular. Eleanor watched over him, struck by how different he looked in sleep, younger somehow. The constant alertness and tension momentarily eased from his features. Dawn found them both awake, breaking camp efficiently and continuing their journey southward. The day was hotter than the previous one, the June sun beating down relentlessly as they traveled through increasingly rough terrain. Rhett set a steady pace, occasionally reaching back to offer Eleanor a hand over particularly difficult stretches. By midday, they had reached a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of Texas hill country. In the distance, a small plume of smoke was visible, Rhett's cabin still burning, or perhaps deliberately set ablaze again to ensure nothing survived. "We're making good time," Rhett said, offering Eleanor his canteen. "Another few hours and we'll reach the safe house." Eleanor drank gratefully, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Will your friend be there, the one you mentioned?" "Unlikely. Miguel uses it mostly in winter. But it will have supplies, maybe horses if we're lucky." He took the canteen back, his fingers brushing hers. "From there we can make it to Austin in 2 days hard riding. And if Bradford's men are waiting for us," Rhett's expression darkened, "they won't be. The only other person who knows about this place is Miguel, and he'd die before betraying me." They continued their journey, the terrain gradually shifting from steep hills to more gentle slopes covered in cedar and oak. Late afternoon shadows were lengthening when they finally came within sight of a small stone structure nestled against a hillside, partially concealed by trees. Rhett held up a hand, signaling Eleanor to stop. "Wait here," he said quietly, drawing his pistol. "Let me make sure it's clear." She watched anxiously as he approached the structure cautiously, moving from tree to tree for cover. He circled the building completely before signaling her to join him. The safe house was simple, but solid, a one-room stone building with a small stable attached. Inside, they found basic supplies: dried beans, coffee, ammunition, lanterns, and other necessities. No horses, Rhett observed with disappointment. Miguel must have moved them to his main ranch. Eleanor sank onto a bench, allowing herself to fully feel the fatigue of their long journey for the first time. "At least we have shelter for the night." Rhett nodded, setting about lighting a fire in the small hearth and preparing a more substantial meal than they had managed the night before. Eleanor watched him work, struck again by his competence and the easy way he adapted to circumstances. "You're staring, Miss Kincaid," he said without looking up from the beans he was preparing. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but didn't look away. "Just thinking how different you are from most men I've known." Now he did look up, curiosity in his eyes. "Different how? Most men I know would be complaining by now about the walking, the danger, having to flee their home." She smiled slightly. "You just adapt, keep moving forward." He shrugged, turning back to his cooking. "No sense wasting energy on what can't be changed." "Is that a philosophy you learned as a ranger?" "No," he said quietly. "That was from Abigail. She always said life gives you enough real problems without inventing more through complaint." Eleanor moved to help him with the meal, working alongside him in comfortable silence. As they ate, she found herself studying the safe house, the well-maintained supplies, the sturdy construction, the strategic position. "You've been preparing for something like this for a long time, haven't you?" she asked. Rhett set down his plate. "After Abigail died, I realized how vulnerable people are against powerful, corrupt men. They control the law, the banks, sometimes even the rangers." His expression hardened. "So yes, I've spent years building a network of safe places, gathering evidence, making connections with honest officials who might actually do something when presented with proof." "And have you succeeded? Before this, I mean." "Twice," he said. "Once in the Panhandle, once near the Louisiana border. Corrupt judges both times. One went to prison, the other disappeared before he could be arrested." His tone made it clear he had no regrets about whatever fate had befallen the man. Eleanor considered this new information about the man who had come to her defense. "So this isn't just about your sister anymore, it's become your purpose." "It was," he agreed, "until recently." "What changed?" He looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. "I met someone who made me think there might be more to life than just settling old scores." Eleanor's breath caught at his words and the intensity behind them. Before she could respond, a sound outside froze them both, the distinctive clink of a horseshoe on stone. Rhett was on his feet instantly, gun drawn, motioning Eleanor toward the back of the room where a small window offered a potential escape route. She grabbed their evidence satchel, positioning herself to flee if necessary. A voice called from outside. "Holloway, you in there, amigo?" Rhett's tension visibly eased. "Miguel," he said to Eleanor, then called out, "Coming out, don't shoot." He opened the door carefully, stepping onto the small porch with his hands visible. Eleanor watched through the window as a Mexican man about Rhett's age dismounted from a handsome pinto horse. The two men embraced briefly, speaking in rapid Spanish that Eleanor couldn't quite follow. After a moment, Rhett gestured toward the house, and Miguel followed him inside. Eleanor Kincaid, This is Miguel Castillo, the best tracker in Texas and the only man I trust completely. Rhett introduced them. Miguel, Miss Kincaid is the woman I told you about in my message. Miguel removed his hat, bowing slightly to Eleanor. The woman with the courage of a lion, she. Rhett's message said you stood up to Judge Thornton himself. Eleanor smiled, finding herself liking the man immediately. The judge's cane stood up to my face in return, I'm afraid. Miguel's expression darkened at the mention of the assault. Cowards, these men who strike women. In my village, such men would be dragged behind horses. A tempting image, Eleanor agreed, but we're pursuing a more legal form of justice. Rhett had moved to the window, checking outside. You weren't followed, Miguel shook his head. I was careful, as always. But there is news you should hear. Bradford's men are everywhere between here and Austin. Roadblocks, patrols. They're offering $500 for information about either of you. That's a fortune to most people in these parts, Rhett said grimly. It gets worse, Miguel continued. Judge Thornton has issued warrants for both of you, theft and assault for Miss Kincaid, attempted murder for you, Rhett. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Attempted murder? Who are we supposed to have tried to kill? Phillips, Miguel replied. He claims you ambushed him and his men without provocation, shot one of them in the arm. Rhett cursed under his breath. They're trying to close every legal avenue to us. With warrants out, even honest lawmen will be looking for us. Miguel nodded. Which is why I brought 3 horses and came to guide you by a different route. We can't take you directly to Austin now, too many eyes watching. But I know someone in San Antonio who can help get your evidence to the right people. Hope flared in Eleanor's chest. When do we leave? First light, Miguel replied. Too dangerous to travel at night in this terrain, and the horses need rest. He glanced at Rhett. I brought supplies, including fresh clothing for both of you. You'll need to change your appearance if we're to have any chance of getting through. The 3 of them spent the evening planning their route and preparing for the journey ahead. Miguel had brought not only provisions but also news about which of Bradford's allies were positioned where, gleaned from his extensive network of friends and family throughout the region. As the night deepened, Miguel took first watch, insisting that Rhett and Eleanor get proper rest for the difficult ride ahead. The safe house had only 1 bed, little more than a straw mattress on a wooden frame, and Rhett immediately offered it to Eleanor. Take it, he said when she began to protest. I've slept on worse than this floor many times. As have I, she replied stubbornly. I won't take comfort at your expense, especially in your friend's home. Miguel, who had been checking his rifle by the door, chuckled. Dios mío, you two are well matched in stubbornness. He nodded toward the bed. It will fit too if you're not too proud. And before you object to propriety, remember that tomorrow we may all be dodging bullets. Sleep matters more than social niceties out here. With that, he stepped outside to take up his watch position, leaving Rhett and Eleanor in awkward silence. He has a point about the sleep, Rhett said finally, not quite meeting her eyes. Eleanor considered their situation. They were fugitives, exhausted, facing unknown dangers tomorrow. And despite the impropriety, she trusted Rhett Holloway completely, a realization that should have been more surprising than it was. Very well, she said, trying to sound more matter-of-fact than she felt. Back-to-back should be acceptable. They arranged themselves awkwardly on the narrow bed, both fully clothed except for their boots, lying rigid with their backs touching. Eleanor was acutely aware of Rhett's warmth and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Despite her exhaustion, she found sleep elusive. Rhett, she whispered after several minutes. Are you awake? Yes, came his quiet reply. What you said earlier about meeting someone who made you think about more than settling scores. She hesitated. Did you mean me? The silence stretched so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he shifted slightly, his voice low. "From the first moment I saw you in Bandera standing up to Bradford in the general store, I knew you were different. Then watching you teach those children, seeing your kindness to Mrs. Carson." He paused. "When the judge struck you, something in me just snapped. It wasn't just about Abigail anymore. It was about you, about not letting another brave, good person suffer for doing what's right." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. She reached back, finding his hand with hers, twining their fingers together. "Thank you for being my voice that day," she whispered, "and for everything since." His hand tightened around hers. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "when this is over, if we make it through, I want—" "I know," she said softly. "Me too." They fell asleep that way, backs pressed together, hands clasped, a silent promise between them for whatever future they might have if they survived the days ahead. Morning came with Miguel's gentle but insistent wake-up call. They ate a quick breakfast before changing into the clothing. He had brought simple ranch clothes for Rhett. And for Eleanor, a riding skirt and blouse that would allow her to ride astride more comfortably than her town dress. "You'll be posing as my sister and her American husband," Miguel explained as they prepared the horses. "Traveling to San Antonio for a family baptism. Keep your heads down. Let me do the talking if we encounter anyone." "Will that be enough?" Eleanor asked, securing the precious evidence satchel to her saddle. "My face is still bruised, and we're both named in those warrants." "Which is why I brought these," Miguel replied, producing a wide-brimmed hat with a veil for Eleanor and a fake mustache and spectacles for Rhett. Simple but effective, especially if no one gets a close look. Thus disguised, they set out just as dawn was breaking, taking a route that avoided main roads and settlements. Miguel led them through ravines and dry creek beds, across stretches of land where the soil was too poor for farming, but provided excellent cover for travelers wishing to remain unseen. They rode steadily through the morning, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and take water. Eleanor, though an experienced rider, found the pace and terrain challenging, but she refused to show any weakness or ask for extra breaks. Rhett rode beside her whenever the path allowed, occasionally offering quiet words of encouragement when a particularly difficult stretch loomed ahead. By midday, they had covered impressive ground, but the heat had become nearly unbearable. When they stopped to water the horses at a small spring, Miguel pulled Rhett aside, pointing to distant dust on the horizon. "Riders," he said quietly, "many of them moving fast." Rhett squinted against the sun. "Bradford's men, or the sheriff's posse. Either way, not friends," Miguel calculated quickly. "They're following the main trail. If we cut through Diablo Canyon, we can stay ahead of them." Eleanor joined them, reading the concern on their faces. "What is it?" "Possible pursuit," Rhett explained. "We need to change course." Miguel looked troubled. "Diablo Canyon is the fastest route, but there's a reason they call it that. Narrow passages, loose rock, dangerous in the best conditions, with 3 riders. We don't have a choice," Rhett said. "If they catch us in open country, we're finished." Eleanor tightened her saddle straps. "Then we take the canyon. I can keep up." The men exchanged glances, and something passed between them: respect, concern, and finally agreement. They mounted quickly and set off toward a jagged line of cliffs in the distance. Diablo Canyon lived up to its name. The entrance was barely wide enough for a horse and rider to pass single file, the walls rising sheer on either side, blotting out much of the sky. The footing was treacherous loose shale and gravel that slid under the horses' hooves, forcing them to pick their way cautiously despite the urgency of their situation. Miguel led, then Eleanor, with Rhett bringing up the rear. The deeper they went into the canyon, The more oppressive it became hot, still air trapped between the towering walls, the occasional skittering of displaced rocks the only sound besides their horses' labored breathing. "Stay centered," Miguel called back to Eleanor. "The edges are less stable." She nodded, concentrating on guiding her horse along the safest path. They had progressed perhaps a mile into the canyon when a distant sound froze them all, the echo of voices, carried on the still air from the canyon entrance. "They're following us in," Rhett said grimly. "We need to move faster." Miguel shook his head. "Too dangerous at speed, one misstep in here." "Then we need to find a defensive position," Eleanor suggested. "Somewhere we can hold them off." Rhett nodded approvingly at her thinking. "Miguel, is there a wider spot ahead, somewhere with some cover?" "About half a mile. A rockfall created a natural barrier years ago. Good position, hard to flank." They pressed on, the sounds of pursuit growing gradually louder behind them. When they reached the rockfall Miguel had mentioned, they quickly dismounted, leading their horses behind the largest boulders and securing them. Rhett positioned Eleanor behind a massive boulder that offered excellent protection, handing her the Winchester rifle. "Remember what I showed you about aiming for center mass. Don't try for fancy shots." She checked the rifle with practiced hands. "I won't let you down." The look he gave her then was complicated pride, fear, and something deeper that made her heart race despite the danger. "I know," he said simply, before moving to take up his own position beside Miguel. They didn't have long to wait. Within minutes, the first riders appeared at the far end of the open area, 4 men, moving cautiously, rifles ready. One Eleanor recognized as Phillips, Bradford's enforcer. The others were unknown to her, but their hard faces and professional manner suggested hired guns rather than local posse members. "Holloway," Phillips called out. "We know you're there. Send out the woman and the evidence and you might walk away from this." "Familiar offer," Rhett muttered. Then louder, "And if I refuse," Phillips laughed, an ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Then we dig you out like the rats you are. We've got 8 men and plenty of ammunition." 8 against 3, Miguel whispered. "Not good odds in an extended fight." Eleanor studied the terrain, noting a narrow ledge that ran along one wall of the canyon above their position. "What if we could reduce those odds?" she asked quietly. Both men looked at her questioningly. "That ledge," she pointed. "If someone could get up there with a rifle, they'd have a clear shot at anyone trying to approach from either side." Rhett followed her gaze, then nodded slowly. "It could work, but it's a dangerous climb and whoever goes would be exposed during the ascent." "I'll go," Eleanor said immediately. "I'm the lightest, and I can shoot well enough to keep them pinned down." "Absolutely not," Rhett began, but Miguel cut him off. "She's right, amigo. You and I are better shots, but we're also bigger targets, and we need at least 2 rifles down here to maintain covering fire." Rhett looked torn, clearly hating the idea of Eleanor taking such a risk, but unable to deny the tactical advantage it would provide. "I can do this, Rhett," she said, touching his arm. "Trust me." The emotion in his eyes nearly undid her resolve, but after a moment he nodded once. "All right. But you wait for our signal. Miguel and I will create a distraction, draw their fire. You move only when they're focused on us." The plan set, they repositioned themselves, Miguel and Rhett spreading out to create the impression of more defenders. Eleanor removed her riding boots for better grip, tucking the Winchester securely across her back. "Ready?" Rhett asked, meeting her eyes one last time. She nodded. "Ready." Miguel fired first, a carefully aimed shot that took down one of the exposed riders. Phillips and the others scattered for cover, returning fire with a barrage that sent stone chips flying all around their position. Rhett joined in, his Colt roaring steadily as he picked his shots. Under cover of the firefight, Eleanor began her ascent, finding handholds in the rough canyon wall and pulling herself up inch by careful inch. The rock was hot to the touch, burning her palms, but she gritted her teeth and continued climbing. 20 feet up, then 30, her muscles screaming with the effort but her determination unwavering. Below, the gunfight intensified. She heard Miguel cry out once hit, though not badly from the sound of his continued firing. Rhett's voice called out encouragement to his friend, interspersed with well-aimed shots that kept the attackers pinned down. Finally, Eleanor reached the ledge, pulling herself onto it with the last of her strength. She lay flat, catching her breath, then carefully positioned the Winchester, sighting along its barrel at the rocks where Phillips and his men had taken cover. Her first shot caught them by surprise, striking a man who had thought himself safely concealed. Her second forced another to abandon his position, exposing him to Rhett's fire from below. The unexpected angle of attack threw the attackers into momentary confusion, exactly what they had hoped for. "Phillips," Rhett shouted during a lull in the firing, "your men are dying for Bradford's greed." "Is it worth it?" "More than you know, Holloway," came the reply. "The railroad deal alone is worth hundreds of thousands. Bradford won't let your evidence reach Austin." Eleanor exchanged glances with Rhett below. Phillips had just confirmed the railroad corruption, shouting it for all to hear. It wouldn't stand up in court, but it confirmed they were on the right track. The gunfight resumed with renewed intensity. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see what Rhett and Miguel couldn't. 3 of Phillips's men were working their way around the far side of the rockfall, attempting to flank them. She took careful aim, dropping one with a clean shot. The other 2 dove for cover, but now they knew they were exposed. Below, Rhett seemed to understand her warning shots, adjusting his position to cover the new threat. The stalemate continued for what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes. The attackers gradually fell back to more distant cover, their enthusiasm dampened by the unexpected resistance and their reduced numbers. During a lull, Miguel crawled over to Rhett, his shirt sleeve dark with blood but his eyes alert. They conferred briefly, then Rhett looked up at Eleanor, signaling her to hold her position. "Phillips," he called out again, "your men are down to half strength and you're not getting any closer. Take your wounded and go while you still can." There was a long silence, broken only by the groans of injured men. Finally, Phillips's voice came again, strained with anger but also resignation. "This isn't over, Holloway. Bradford has friends all the way to the state capitol." "Then we'll see them in court too," Rhett replied. "Now get your men out of here before we decide to finish this." Slowly, the attackers began to withdraw, carrying their wounded. Rhett and Miguel maintained their positions, rifles ready, until the sounds of the retreating horses had faded completely. "Eleanor," Rhett called up to her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she replied, already planning her descent. "Is Miguel badly hurt?" "Just a graze," Miguel answered for himself. "Worth it to see you shoot like a ranger from up there, señorita." The climb down proved more difficult than the ascent, with fatigue making Eleanor's movements less precise. About halfway down, her foot slipped on a loose stone, and she found herself sliding, scraping against the rough rock face. A strong arm caught her as she fell the last few feet. Rhett positioned beneath her, absorbing the impact of her fall with his own body. They landed hard, Rhett taking the brunt of the fall on his back, Eleanor sprawled across his chest. For a moment they lay there breathless, their faces inches apart. "That was reckless," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Brave, brilliant, and completely reckless. It worked, didn't it?" She replied, suddenly very aware of his arms still around her, the rapid beating of his heart against hers. "Yes," he admitted, his eyes never leaving hers. It worked. A discreet cough from Miguel broke the moment. As touching as this is, we should move before Phillips decides to return with reinforcements. They scrambled to their feet, both slightly flushed, and hurried to help Miguel tend his wound, a clean shot through the fleshy part of his upper arm that had bled freely, but wasn't life-threatening. "We got lucky," Rhett said as Eleanor bandaged Miguel's arm with strips torn from her petticoat. "Phillips could have brought more men, pushed harder." "Not luck," Miguel replied. "Bradford needs to keep this quiet. A small team to eliminate us quietly is one thing. A small war in Diablo Canyon would raise too many questions. Either way, they'll be watching all roads to Austin now," Eleanor pointed out. "How do we get the evidence through?" Miguel grinned despite his pain. "That is why we go to San Antonio first. My cousin Carlos runs a freight business, legitimate, but with certain specialized services for those who need to move valuable items discreetly." "Smuggling, he means," Rhett clarified with a hint of amusement. "Such an ugly word," Miguel protested. "We prefer alternative transportation solutions." They mounted up again, proceeding more cautiously through the remainder of the canyon. Miguel's wound slowed their pace, but by nightfall they had emerged onto rolling plains that offered better visibility and faster riding. They made camp in a small grove of trees beside a stream, taking turns standing watch through the night. During her watch, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how drastically her life had changed in just 3 days. From respected bookkeeper to fugitive, from solitary crusader to part of something larger. And Rhett Holloway, a man she barely knew yet trusted with her life. A man who looked at her with growing tenderness, despite the danger surrounding them. "Penny, for your thoughts," his voice came quietly as he joined her by the small fire. He should have been sleeping, but she wasn't surprised to find him awake. "Just thinking about how quickly everything can change," she replied. 3 days ago, my biggest concern was balancing Mr. Abernathy's ledgers." He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Do you regret it, speaking up against Thornton?" "No," she said without hesitation, "though I might have chosen a moment when he wasn't holding his cane." That drew a low chuckle from Rhett. Practical wisdom. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames. Finally, Eleanor gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind since their conversation the previous night. "After this is over, if we succeed, what then?" He turned to look at her, firelight playing across his features. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether a certain strong-willed bookkeeper might consider having a former Texas Ranger in her life on a more permanent basis." Her heart quickened at his words. "I imagine she might, provided he understands she'll continue to speak her mind, regardless of consequences." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said softly, his hand finding hers. "In fact, I'm counting on it." The moment was interrupted by Miguel returning from scouting the perimeter. If he noticed their clasped hands or the intimate atmosphere, he was gentleman enough not to mention it, instead reporting that all seemed quiet for the night. They reached San Antonio the following afternoon, approaching the city cautiously. Miguel led them to a modest neighborhood on the outskirts where his cousin Carlos maintained his business, a legitimate freight operation from the front, with other activities conducted more discreetly from the rear warehouse. Carlos, a barrel-chested man with a magnificent mustache and the same easy charm as Miguel, welcomed them warmly, his face growing serious when he heard their story. "Bradford has influence even here," he warned them, ushering them into his private office behind the warehouse. "His bank finances half the businesses in town, but he does not control the Castillo family." He examined their evidence with a practiced eye, nodding approvingly at the detailed documentation. "This is thorough work." The railroad commissioner in Austin will be very interested. He has been suspicious of these land purchases." "Can you get it to him safely?" Rhett asked. Carlos smiled broadly. "I have a shipment of fine furniture leaving for Austin tomorrow morning. 3 wagons, heavily guarded officially because of the valuable cargo, but my men know the real prize will be hidden in a secret compartment." He patted the evidence satchel. "No one will look for documents in a shipment that already has an official manifest and inspection certificate." "And us?" Eleanor asked. "We need to be there to testify, to explain the evidence." Carlos exchanged glances with Miguel. "That is more complicated. Bradford's description of you both is in every law office and ranger outpost between here and Austin. The regular routes are being watched." "There must be another way," Rhett insisted. Carlos considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There is the river route. Slower, less direct, but my cousin Pablo runs a small steamboat. He could take you as far as Bastrop. From there, it's a short ride to Austin through back country." Plans were made for their departure the following morning. Carlos insisted they stay the night in rooms above his warehouse, providing them with fresh clothing, hot meals, and the first real beds they had enjoyed since fleeing Bandera. That evening, after a hearty dinner with the extended Castillo family, Eleanor found herself alone with Rhett on a small balcony overlooking the warehouse yard. The night was warm, stars brilliantly clear above them. "Tomorrow the evidence goes to Austin," she said. "Even if something happens to us on the river journey, the truth about Bradford and Thornton will come out." Rhett nodded, his face solemn in the moonlight. "That's what matters most. The evidence is solid land records that don't match the official registry, witness statements, the pattern of foreclosures along the railroad route. The commissioner will act on it." "Do you really believe that?" Eleanor asked. "After all you've seen of corruption?" "I believe there are still honest men in power," he replied. "Not enough of them, perhaps, but enough to make a difference when given the chance." He turned to face her fully. "And I believe in what people like you can accomplish by refusing to be silenced." She smiled at that. "People like us, you mean?" "Us," he agreed softly, taking her hands in his. "Eleanor, these past few days have been dangerous and desperate, but they've also shown me something I wasn't sure existed anymore." "What's that?" "Hope," he said simply. "For justice, yes, but also for something more personal. Something I thought I'd given up on after Abigail died, and I dedicated myself to hunting men like Thornton." Her heart beat faster as he stepped closer, one hand gently touching her bruised cheek, which was now healing to a yellowish purple. "I know it's fast," he continued, his voice low and earnest, "and perhaps foolish given our circumstances, but life out here has taught me not to waste time when something matters." His eyes held hers steadily. "And you matter to me, Eleanor Kincaid. More than I thought possible in such a short time." "Rhett," she whispered, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Whatever she might have said was lost as his lips met hers, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. It was a kiss born of shared danger and mutual respect, of admiration that had blossomed rapidly into something deeper. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Eleanor found herself smiling despite the uncertainty that still lay ahead. "If that was meant to silence me, Mr. Holloway," she teased softly, "you should know it will have the opposite effect." He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I would expect nothing less, Miss Kincaid." They remained on the balcony a while longer, talking of smaller things, memories of childhood, favorite books, hopes for the future that seemed more possible now, despite the dangers they still faced. When they finally said goodnight, returning to their separate rooms, Eleanor felt a certainty settling in her heart that whatever happened next, her life had changed irrevocably, and for the better. Dawn brought fog rolling in from the river, providing excellent cover as they made their way to the small dock where Pablo Castillo's steamboat waited. The Esperanza was not large, primarily used for moving goods rather than passengers, but it was well maintained, and more importantly, piloted by a man who knew every bend and shallow in the river between San Antonio and Bastrop. Carlos came to see them off, confirming that the evidence had already been dispatched in the furniture wagons with his most trusted men. "They will reach Austin by tomorrow evening," he assured them. "Your journey will take a day longer, but Pablo will get you there safely." The farewell between the cousins was emotional, with promises to meet again in better circumstances. As the Esperanza pulled away from the dock, its small steam engine chugging steadily, Eleanor felt both relief at leaving the city behind and apprehension about the journey still ahead. The river route was indeed indirect, winding through countryside far from main roads and settlements. Pablo proved to be as skilled as promised, navigating shallow sections and avoiding snags with practiced ease. Miguel, his arm still bandaged but healing well, spent much of the journey talking with his cousin, catching up on family news and sharing stories of their adventures. Rhett and Eleanor found themselves with rare moments of peace, standing at the rail watching the Texas landscape slide by. The events of the past days had forged a bond between them that went beyond their growing romantic feelings, a partnership of equals, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "What will you do when this is over?" Eleanor asked as they watched a flight of herons rise from the riverbank. "Return to being a cattle detective," Rhett considered the question. "I'm not sure that life fits me anymore," he admitted. "Riding from town to town, always moving on. It served its purpose when all I wanted was to find men like the one who killed Abigail. And now—" He turned to her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way it rarely was. "Now I find myself thinking about putting down roots, finding work that builds something instead of just hunting wrongdoers." His eyes met hers. "Preferably somewhere near a certain bookkeeper if she's amenable." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "I think she might be," she said softly, "though Bandera may not welcome either of us back with open arms after this." "Then we'll find somewhere else," he replied simply. "Austin, perhaps, or one of the growing towns further west. Somewhere that needs honest people willing to stand for something." The journey continued peacefully through that day and the next. The rhythmic chug of the steamboat's engine and the gentle slap of water against the hull creating a soothing backdrop to their conversations and quiet moments together. By the second evening, Pablo informed them they would reach Bastrop by the following noon. "From there," he explained over dinner in the small cabin, "it is perhaps 4 hours' ride to Austin if you push hard. Carlos has arranged for horses to be waiting with my friend at the dock." Miguel, who had been unusually quiet during the meal, looked up sharply. "Have you seen any other boats following us? Or riders along the shore?" Pablo frowned. "No riders, but there was a steamboat behind us earlier today, keeping its distance but following the same route." Rhett and Eleanor exchanged concerned glances. "Many boats use this river," Pablo continued, noting their reaction. "But if you are worried, we can travel through the night. It will be slower, more dangerous, but we could reach Bastrop by early morning." "Do it," Rhett decided. Better to arrive tired than not arrive at all. The night passage proved challenging. Without moonlight to guide them, Pablo was forced to navigate largely by memory, and the occasional lantern briefly lit to check their position. Progress was slow, the boat sometimes scraping against unseen obstacles, but steadily moving toward their destination. Eleanor tried to rest in the small cabin, but anxiety kept her awake. She finally gave up and joined Rhett on deck, where he stood watching the dark shoreline slip by. "Can't sleep?" he asked as she came to stand beside him. She shook her head. "Too much on my mind." He put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "We're almost there, Eleanor. By tomorrow night, the evidence will be in the commissioner's hands. Our testimony will just reinforce what the documents already prove. And if Bradford's men are waiting in Bastrop, or on the road to Austin, then we face them," he said simply. "We've come too far to turn back now." She leaned into his strength, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I keep thinking about what comes after," she admitted. "If we succeed, if Bradford and Thornton face justice, what then? Can life ever be normal again?" Rhett was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't know if normal is the right word," he said finally, "but better, yes. Different, certainly." His arm tightened around her. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. That much I know for certain." The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet conviction, eased something in Eleanor's chest. She turned her face up to his, and their lips met in a kiss that held both promise and reassurance. They reached Bastrop shortly after dawn, the small town just beginning to stir as Pablo guided the Esperanza to a weathered dock. True to Carlos's word, a man waited there with 3 horses saddled and ready. Pablo embraced his cousin before they disembarked. "Vaya con Dios," he said. "May you find justice in Austin." "Thank you, my friend," Rhett replied, clasping the man's hand firmly. "Your family has taken great risks for us. We won't forget it." They mounted quickly, eager to be on their way. The horses were fresh and strong, well suited for the hard ride ahead. As they left Bastrop behind, taking a trail that wound through woods and farmland rather than the main road, Eleanor felt a growing sense of anticipation. After days of flight and struggle, they were finally nearing their goal. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when Miguel, who was leading the way, suddenly raised his hand for them to stop. He pointed silently to the ridge ahead, where dust rose from multiple riders moving parallel to their route. "Bradford's men," Eleanor whispered. "Most likely," Rhett replied grimly. "They must have guessed our destination and are covering all approaches to Austin." Miguel studied the terrain ahead. "We can cut through the creek bed there," he suggested, pointing to a tree-lined depression. "It will slow us down, but keep us out of sight until we reach the Davis farm. From there, we can take the old Spanish trail. It's rarely used since the new road was built." They proceeded cautiously, keeping to cover whenever possible. The creek bed was muddy and difficult for the horses, but it provided excellent concealment. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the abandoned Davis farmhouse, pausing briefly to rest the horses and check for pursuit. "No sign of them," Miguel reported after scouting the area. "I think we lost them at the creek crossing." "How much further to Austin?" Eleanor asked, stretching her stiff muscles. "About 2 hours if we push hard," Rhett replied. "We should reach the city by dusk." They continued their journey with renewed determination, the terrain gradually changing as they neared the capital. The Spanish trail proved to be little more than a deer path in places, overgrown and difficult to follow, but it kept them well away from the main roads where Bradford's men might be waiting. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, when they finally crested a hill and saw Austin spread below them, a growing city of about 15,000 souls, its government building standing proud at its center. "We made it," Eleanor breathed, relief washing over her. "Not quite yet," Rhett cautioned. "We still need to reach the railroad commissioner's office without being spotted." Miguel pointed to a modest building near the Capitol. "That is Carlos's Austin warehouse. We should go there first. His men will know if the evidence arrived safely, and they can guide us to the commissioner without being seen." They entered the city as full darkness fell, keeping to side streets and moving at a pace that wouldn't attract attention. The warehouse was quiet when they arrived, only a single lantern burning in a ground-floor window. Miguel knocked in a particular pattern, and the door was quickly opened by one of Carlos's men. "Gracias a Dios," the man exclaimed when he saw them. "We feared you had been captured." "The evidence?" Rhett asked immediately. "Safe," the man assured them, leading them inside and securing the door behind them. "Delivered to Commissioner Hayes this afternoon. He has been studying it for hours and wishes to speak with you as soon as possible." Relief washed over Eleanor so strongly that her knees nearly buckled. Rhett steadied her with a hand at her elbow, his own face showing the same profound relief. "When can we see him?" she asked. "Now, if you wish," came a new voice from the back of the warehouse. A tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s stepped forward, extending his hand. "Robert Hayes, Railroad Commissioner for the state of Texas. And I must say, you have provided me with the most extraordinary documentation of corruption I have seen in 20 years of public service." Over the next hour, Commissioner Hayes questioned them thoroughly about the evidence, having them explain connections between documents and provide context for the witness statements. He took copious notes, occasionally nodding with grim satisfaction. "This is more than enough to justify arrests," he said finally. "Judge Thornton, Mr. Bradford, and several of their associates will be taken into custody tonight. I've already sent telegrams to the governor and the Attorney General's office." "What about the warrants against us?" Eleanor asked. "We're still fugitives according to the law." Hayes smiled thinly. "Those warrants have been suspended pending investigation. By tomorrow, they will be formally vacated." He looked between Rhett and Eleanor with genuine respect. "You've taken extraordinary risks to expose this corruption. The state of Texas owes you a debt of gratitude." "We didn't do it for gratitude," Rhett replied. "We did it because it was right." Hayes nodded, understanding. "Nevertheless, you have my thanks and my assurance that this evidence will be acted upon swiftly and decisively." He gathered his papers, preparing to leave. "I suggest you remain here tonight. By morning, the arrests will have been made and you can move about freely. I'll send word when it's safe." After the commissioner departed, Carlos's men provided them with food and showed them to simple but comfortable rooms above the warehouse. Miguel bid them good night, his relief evident in the relaxed set of his shoulders for the first time since they had fled Bandera. Alone in the hallway outside their rooms, Rhett and Eleanor stood close, the reality of their success still sinking in. "We did it," she said softly. "It hardly seems real." "It is," he assured her, taking her hands in his. "By tomorrow, Bradford and Thornton will be facing justice. The evidence is too strong, the corruption too blatant for even their powerful friends to protect them." Eleanor felt tears of relief and exhaustion threatening. "And us? What happens to us tomorrow?" Rhett's eyes were steady on hers, his voice low and certain. "Tomorrow we start the rest of our lives, Eleanor. Together, if that's what you want." "It is," she whispered, her heart too full for more elaborate declarations. "It's exactly what I want." His kiss was tender, a promise of all that might lie ahead now that the danger was behind them. When they finally parted, both were smiling despite their exhaustion. "Rest," he said, touching her cheek gently. "Tomorrow is the beginning." True to Commissioner Hayes's word, by mid-morning the next day, news had spread throughout Austin of the arrests. Bradford, Thornton, Phillips, and 5 of their associates had been taken into custody before dawn, charged with corruption, fraud, conspiracy, and in Phillips's case, attempted murder. The evidence had been so overwhelming that not even their political connections could shield them. Hayes sent a message to the warehouse, inviting Rhett, Eleanor, and Miguel to his office to discuss next steps. There, He informed them that their statements would be needed for the upcoming trials, but their personal safety was now assured. The governor himself has taken an interest in this case, Hayes explained. He's particularly disturbed by the manipulation of the railroad route for personal profit. Such corruption threatens the very future of Texas. What about the people who lost their homes and land? Eleanor asked. Mrs. Carson and the others. Hayes nodded approvingly at her concern. Restitution will be part of any resolution. We've already begun reviewing all property transactions connected to Bradford's bank over the past 5 years. After the meeting, the three of them walked through Austin's streets. No longer fugitives, but heroes of a sort, though few people yet knew their role in the events unfolding in the newspapers and telegraph offices across the state. What will you do now? Miguel asked as they paused for lunch at a small cafe. Returned to Bandera, Rhett and Eleanor exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. I think not, Rhett replied. Too many difficult memories there. We were thinking of starting fresh, perhaps here in Austin. Miguel raised an eyebrow at the "we," a smile playing at his lips. I see much has changed since you came to my cabin asking for help tracking a corrupt judge. Rhett's hand found Eleanor's on the table, their fingers intertwining naturally. Everything has changed, he agreed. For the better. In the weeks that followed, Rhett and Eleanor did indeed make Austin their home. With a letter of recommendation from Commissioner Hayes, Eleanor secured a position as a senior bookkeeper for a reputable bank, one that prided itself on ethical lending practices. Rhett, drawing on his experience as a Texas Ranger, was offered a role with the state attorney general's office, investigating corruption cases similar to the one they had exposed. They found a small house on the outskirts of the growing city, close enough to their work, but with enough land around it to satisfy Rhett's need for open spaces. Miguel visited often, always bringing news from his extensive family network and occasionally updates on Bandera, where Mrs. Carson and others had successfully reclaimed their properties. The trials of Bradford, Thornton, and their associates became the talk of Texas that summer and fall. Eleanor and Rhett both testified, their clear, detailed accounts compelling even to the most skeptical jurors. In the end, Bradford received 20 years in prison, Thornton 15, and Phillips 12 for his role in the attempted murders. On a crisp October evening, 6 months to the day after Judge Thornton had struck Eleanor in Bandera's town square, Rhett took her riding to a hilltop overlooking Austin. The city lights twinkled below them as the sun set, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors they had seen when first approaching Austin as fugitives. You ever think about how differently things might have turned out? Eleanor asked as they sat on a blanket, sharing a simple picnic. If you hadn't stepped forward that day in the square, Rhett considered the question, his expression thoughtful. I'd like to think I would have found another way to help, that we would have found each other somehow. He smiled at her. But I'm grateful it happened as it did, despite all the danger that followed. As am I, she agreed, leaning against his shoulder. Though I could have done without being shot at quite so often, he laughed, the sound warm in the cooling evening air. Hopefully that part of our lives is behind us now. Hopefully, she echoed, though they both knew his work sometimes still put him in harm's way. It was a risk they had accepted together. Rhett shifted, suddenly seeming nervous, an unusual state for a man normally so composed. Eleanor, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. She turned to face him fully, her heart quickening at his tone. Yes. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small ring, a simple gold band set with a modest diamond. When I said I wanted us to build a life together, I meant it in every possible way. His eyes held hers, sincere and full of love. "Eleanor Kincaid, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness welled in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "With all my heart, yes." The kiss that followed sealed a promise that had begun that day in Bandera, a day when a woman was struck for speaking her mind, and a cowboy had become her voice. They were married in December, in a small ceremony attended by Miguel and his extensive family, Commissioner Hayes and his wife, and a few close friends they had made in Austin. Mrs. Carson made the journey from Bandera, bringing with her letters of good wishes from others whose lives had been changed by Eleanor and Rhett's courage. Over the years, their partnership only deepened. Eleanor eventually opened her own accounting firm, specializing in detecting financial fraud skills she had honed during their investigation of Bradford's schemes. Rhett continued his work with the Attorney General's office, rising to lead a special unit focused on land fraud and corruption. They had 2 children, a daughter named Abigail, after Rhett's sister, and a son they called James, after Eleanor's father. They raised them to stand up for what was right, to speak their minds regardless of consequences, and to recognize that true strength lay in defending those who couldn't defend themselves. On their 10th anniversary, they returned to Bandera for the first time. The town had changed, grown larger, more prosperous under honest leadership. The courthouse where Judge Thornton had once ruled now housed a judge known for his fairness and integrity. Standing in the town square where their story had begun, Rhett pulled Eleanor close. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. She shook her head, looking up at the man who had become her husband, her partner, her best friend. "Not one," she replied. "Every step led us here together." "Together," he agreed, bending to kiss her in the same spot where he had once defended her right to speak her mind and in doing so, had found his own voice, his purpose, and the love that would define the rest of their lives.